Hello everyone, welcome to CSEN 1001 Computer and Network Security. I am Dr. Amr El-Mogi. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this course, which I personally think is quite an important course for any computer scientist to know very well, not only for its applications in many diverse fields and job opportunities, but also for its basic knowledge as a computer science concept. The TA for this course is going to be Abdurrahman Anwar. In this first lecture, I'm going to be introducing the course, what we will do, the objectives of the course, the outline, and we will also start some basic concepts in security as well. So the objective of the Computer and Network Security course, because it's the only course that we study in the MET for security, it is an introductory course about the topic. And so in this course, we give a lot of focus to the most important tool in security, which is cryptography. And this might be a misconception. Security and cryptography are not the same thing. Cryptography is only a tool that we use in security. It's the most important tool. And so we give it a lot of focus. And so by the end of this course, you should know and understand a lot of cryptography tools. You should know how to achieve different security objectives. You should be able to determine vulnerabilities in the system. You should know how to protect data, how to authenticate a user, how to authenticate a message. And we will also discuss some applications of security, such as internet security, like TLS and IP security, as well as popular applications like blockchains. And to that end, here is actually the outline of the course. We basically start with an introduction, which is today's lecture. And with the introduction, we talk a little bit about the history of cryptography. And then we go into different cryptography tools, starting with symmetric encryption and the modes of encryption. After that, we dive into a very important topic in cryptography, which is called public key cryptography. We discuss some of its applications like message authentication and digital signatures. And within that, we discuss also hash functions. And then we go into applications. We discuss blockchains, followed by key management and distribution and user authentication. And if there is time, we will discuss elliptic curve cryptography. And to be honest, usually there is no time for that. And usually we go into network security. As for the tutorials, they basically follow the lectures. We give a practice assignment for each lecture, and basically every tutorial will follow the lecture. It's very important to note that this course is not pass-fail, so you will be graded at the end of the course. There will be weekly lectures and weekly discussions as well, where we, myself and Abdurrahman, will answer any questions you might have. Okay. The slides are not study material, so you should take comprehensive notes. If you actually watch the videos online, you can rewatch the videos, of course, if you like. But studying from the slides on their own are not enough. You should know the material that I teach very well as the practice assignments in the tutorials as well. We will be using two books in this course. The main one is Cryptography and Network Security, Principles and Practice. This is the one that highlights all the cryptography concepts that we will study. And the second one is called Computer Security Principles and Practice. This is for the network security part and for the introductory part as well. In this course, we will have weekly quizzes. So starting with week 2, we will have actually a quiz that covers all the concepts that were discussed in the week before. So next week, there will be, or in week 2 of the semester, there will be a quiz, and it will cover the content of week 1. And then in week 3, there will be a quiz that covers week 2 and so on. And the quizzes will be best 2 out of 3. There is also going to be practical tasks that we will give you, short programming assignments related to security concepts that you will have to do. The quizzes and the practical part, each one is worth 20%. There is usually a midterm in the course, but in this semester there is no midterm, and so the weight of the semester is combined with the weight of the final, and this chunk is then 60% of the course, and you will have to do a final exam after the semester ends. And I wish you luck in all these the parts of the course. With that, we can actually start discussing the topics of the course. And in this lecture, we will only go into an introduction. And we start from scratch. Since this is the first security course you actually take, we start from the very basic security concepts. Okay, and so I will start with the actual definition of computer security. You can expect that there can be many definitions for computer security. I will actually go into the definition that is put forth by the National Institute for Standards and Technology, or NIST, which defines computer security as the protection afforded to an automated information system in order to attain the applicable objectives of preserving integrity, availability, and confidentiality of information system resources, which includes hardware, software, firmware, information and data, and telecommunications. And let's stop and actually dissect the parts of this definition. First of all, computer security is protection. This is actually the first part. Security is the protection. What do you protect? You protect actually the information system resources. And you protect everything there. You protect the hardware, software, firmware, information and data, and telecommunications. And yes, there can actually be computer attacks that infect or that destroy the actual hardware of a device, can destroy the firmware, can lead to software on your computer or on your phone or whatever device you're using becoming malfunctional. And they can lead to leakage of data or destruction of data or anything like that. And computer security leads to the protection, or actually includes the protection of all of that. When we say protection, we cannot actually leave this term to be vague. And so we actually say in computer security, when we say protection, we have actually three key objectives that we want to achieve, which are preserving integrity, availability, and confidentiality. These are the three key security services that we go for. And we actually call them the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And so we have to understand clearly what each of those concepts and each of those objectives are. Confidentiality is basically the protection of data on a device. So data confidentiality assures that private or confidential information is not made available or disclosed to unauthorized individuals. It means that you can only see data that you are authorized to see. If you're not authorized to see it, the system should not actually allow you to see this data. This is what is called data confidentiality. When this data is of a personal nature, of a private nature, this part is called privacy. So privacy is actually a branch or a subtopic under confidentiality where you are actually dealing with personal information. And when we talk about privacy, we're not actually just talking about who gets access to the data. But privacy has actually become a much bigger topic than that, and it includes also how long the information is stored on a device. If you answer a survey, for example, how long are the or how long is the company allowed to keep this survey on the records? How is data collected from you or from your device? Who gets to see this data? If the data is redacted, for example, or anonymized, is this something that is disclosed to you? How is it anonymized? All of these are actually topics that belong to privacy, which is a subtopic under confidentiality. The second security concept or service is called integrity. And integrity ensures that the system resource does what it is supposed to do. So if it's data integrity, this is basically the service that ensures that data is not manipulated without authorization. It means that if you don't have authorization, you're not allowed to update or delete or add new data to a system. Whereas system integrity refers to the actual applications on the system, that the system basically performs its intended function. That you, if you have, for example, a calculator that adds 2 plus 2, you want to find that the answer is always 4. It doesn't produce sometimes an answer which is 5 or something like that. This is what system integrity means. And the final security service is called availability. This is the final member of the CIA triad. And availability means that the system is always there for you to use. For example, if you're trying to print your transcript, you go to the system and you basically should be able to print it at any time. And the attack on availability is actually a very well-known one. You probably have heard of it before. It's called the Distributed Denial of Service Attack, or DDoS. This attack basically consumes the system resources, such as the communication resources, the bandwidth, for example, such that authorized users are no longer actually able to access the system because there are no more resources to be used. Another type of DDoS attack is one that consumes, for example, the number of TCP connections. Every server can actually establish a maximum number of TCP connections. If the server can establish, for example, 1,000 TCP connections, if you execute an attack where 1,000 fake connections are executed, the server will actually have to reject all the upcoming connections and it will not be available anymore. Okay? So these are the three main security concepts that we have: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. There are often discussions of two additional security services, which is authenticity and accountability. Authenticity, just from its name, is the property of being verifiable, so that you can actually verify someone's identity or verify the origins and the contents of a message. This is actually what authentication refers to. And the final one is accountability, which is the ability to trace an action. So if you do an action on your system, you're not actually allowed to deny it. And if someone else does an action, you are allowed to trace that action back to them, so that there is trust in the system. Okay, so these 5 objectives are the ones that we are going to focus on in the course. These are the ones that we are going to study how to actually do them, what happens when they are not implemented correctly, what are the vulnerabilities that exist from not implementing them correctly, and what are the cryptography tools that actually achieve these 5 security services. So before we go into any of those details, let us discuss how networks are actually attacked. So we discussed what are the security services that we want to achieve. What is actually the danger? Where are the vulnerabilities coming from? We have to understand that, so that we understand what are we actually trying to protect and what are the dangers that we have on any security system. We will focus on the attacks on the communication networks, so that you are actually having data transmitted from one place to the other, and you want to protect this data. And we can actually classify the attacks as passive attacks or active attacks. Passive attacks are mainly eavesdropping or monitoring attacks. That means the attacker doesn't actually want to change the data or doesn't want to gain access to the system or disrupt the system in any way. The attacker just wants to actually monitor the system and tries to learn information. Whereas active attacks are actually active attempts to alter system resources. And the first actually passive attack, the first type of attack, which is the passive attack, is one that, as we said, monitors the system and tries to actually learn something. And this type of attack is very hard to detect because the attacker doesn't actually change anything to the system, and so it becomes difficult to learn when something has happened. So since it is difficult to detect, we actually go to prevention rather than detection. And the typical tool that we have to prevent passive attacks is through encryption. And you might think, well, if I encrypt the data between a sender and the receiver, is this okay? Am I safe? The answer is actually no. The attacker might not be able to decrypt, but that doesn't mean that the attacker cannot learn anything. For example, the attacker can learn about your communication habits. Who do you send to? When do you send this data? Where do you send it from? The attacker can learn, for example, when you are available in your house. When do you leave your house? What is your daily routine? Things like that, the attacker can actually learn without changing anything in your data, just actually by monitoring your traffic. Even if your traffic is encrypted and the attacker cannot read anything in your traffic, that does not mean that you are actually 100% safe. The second type of attack, which is the active attack, this is easier to detect. And so usually the protection methods that we do are ones that try to detect the attack and allow the system to recover. And they can actually take several shapes and forms. The first one is called the masquerade attack. Masquerade attack is basically an attacker pretending to be a legitimate user. Someone, for example, stealing your username and password. And so if they access your system, the system will have no choice but to allow them in because they have a legitimate username and password. And so this is a masquerade attack. The second one is a replay attack. The first attack that we discussed, which is the masquerade attack, for it to be successful, the attacker has to have your credentials. This might not be very easy to do. The replay attack can actually succeed without that. In the replay attack, the attacker simply captures your content and replays them to a destination. Consider, for example, that you are sending your username and password. So you send your username, the system asks you for the password, and so you send your password. Even if you send your password encrypted, the attacker can actually capture the password and just replace it later, replace it as an encrypted piece of information. And the system is expecting an encrypted piece of information. And so the system will think that this is the legitimate password and will actually just let you in or let the attacker in. So we will actually study in the course ways to prevent this from happening. But for now, this is what the replay attack is about. The third type of active attack is called the modification attack. This is also a form of replay attack, but rather than just capturing the message and replaying it as it is, the attacker will modify something. Modify, for example, the sequence of the data or the time or whatever to fool the destination into believing that this is legitimate data. And the final type of active attack is called denial of service. We actually discussed it. It's an attack on system resources. So these are the two types of attacks that we have. And to summarize, these are actually the security services that we will discuss in this course: authentication, data confidentiality, integrity. And there is one that we did not discuss, which is non-repudiation. Non-repudiation actually has to do with accountability. Non-repudiation means that the sender, if it's non-repudiation at the origin, that means the sender that cannot deny sending a message. So let's say, for example, you do a financial transaction and you transfer money to a receiver. You shouldn't be able to deny that you did that. You cannot say, well, no, I didn't actually send anything. I want my money back. So non-repudiation at the origin means that you, as the sender, will not be able to deny sending the message. And there are actually cryptography tools that will allow a system to verify that someone actually did an action in the system. On the other hand, non-repudiation at the destination means that the receiver cannot deny receiving a message. So if you are sending a transaction to someone, this someone should not be able to deny receiving the money. They cannot say, I didn't receive anything from you and you have to send the money again to me. Okay? We will study how to achieve all these security services. How we will achieve them? There are actually several tools, and some of these tools are listed in this table. Encipherment or encryption, we have digital signatures, we have hash functions, we have message authentication codes. We will actually study different cryptography tools to achieve these security objectives. Okay, and with that, we end our basic conceptual introduction. And we can now go directly into our first topic in the course, which is cryptography. We will actually spend more than 2/3 of the course just discussing cryptography tools. This is because they are the most important tool in security. Okay, and they come in different shapes and forms, and they have different uses, and they can actually achieve different security services. And so we will spend quite some time discussing cryptography tools. And today will just be the first lecture to discuss some of these tools. Actually, in today's lecture, we are going to take a walk back through the history of cryptography. We are going to discuss how cryptography came to be. And before the invention of computers, how did people actually encrypt their messages so that they can actually transmit them safely and securely? And so by the end of this lecture, you should be able to understand a little bit more about the history of cryptography. We will learn several classical cryptography algorithms, and you should be able to solve problems related to classical cryptography algorithms, such as encryption and decryption, and actually breaking classical cryptography methods, and so on. Okay. Cryptography is actually not a new concept, and there is evidence that it existed in Egypt long ago, as far back as 1900 BC. We find actually evidence of non-standard hieroglyphs. There are some temples and pyramids where you find hieroglyphics or hieroglyphic characters that are not standard. It is not actually believed to be some secret messages hidden in these temples, but rather it was an attempt from the pharaohs to be a little bit. It was meant to be a joke, basically. So if you are passing by, you can be amused of seeing non-standard hieroglyphs. It's like memes on social media. Okay. In 1500 BC in Mesopotamia, you find actually encrypted recipes for pottery glaze. And this is evidence that when people started to realize that there are pieces of information or data that has commercial value, like a recipe for a pottery glaze, it is worth actually keeping this data confidential or secret from your competitors. And so they started actually coming up with symbols or things like that to actually keep these recipes secret. Starting from 500 BC, we find actually a little bit more complicated ciphers or encryption algorithms, such as the monoalphabetic cipher, which was invented by the Hebrews. The Arabs also had a lot of contributions in cryptography. In 800 AD, we find Al-Kindi. He has actually a lot of writings in how to break ciphers, a method called frequency analysis. And Ahmad al-Qalqashandi also invented several complicated ciphers that became the seed for one of the most used ciphers in history, which is the polyalphabetic cipher, which was invented by Leon Battista Alberti in 1467. Basically, up to this time, up to World War II, all encryption algorithms consisted of basic operations. Just substitution operations. You remove a letter, you insert a symbol, or you insert another letter. You rearrange the letters, for example. You make these substitutions and transpositions much more complicated so that the attacker is fooled. Up until World War II. In World War II, the Germans and the Japanese, they started to invent complicated cryptography machines, and they were called rotor machines. Now, these are the ones, they look like a typewriter, and you can see them actually in the figures in the slide. This was actually the job of the father of computers, Alan Turing, in World War II, which was actually to break the rotor machine. If you haven't seen The Imitation Game, I really strongly recommend that you watch it. It is related actually to this lecture a lot, and you can see the history of cryptography from this movie. These rotor machines were actually the first machines in history that were able to encrypt messages without human intervention. So the humans just typed and the machine produced actually the encrypted message. Before rotor machines, someone had to do the encryption by hand. They would have to do the substitution by hand. Okay. And so rotor machines were a significant advancement, and we will study them towards the end of this lecture in a little bit more detail. That's why they were very difficult to break. And that's why Alan Turing became very valuable, because he realized from the start that it is not going to be possible to break the rotor machines just by hand. And so his idea was to build a new machine to break the rotor machine. And that machine became actually the seed for modern computers. And it led to a huge advancement in cryptography. After that, right after World War II, with the advancement of computers, cryptography became completely different with the publication of the Data Encryption Standard, or DES algorithm, in 1970. And in 1976, a completely new branch of cryptography, which was called asymmetric key algorithms or public key algorithms, were invented by Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman. And this basically became what modern cryptography is about, just computer-based cryptography, very, very complicated encryption mechanisms and methods used in our modern day. Okay, so let's take now the walk through the cryptography algorithms. We'll start actually with classical substitution ciphers. So before rotor machines, all encryption basically consisted of one of two operations or a combination of these two operations. They're called substitution and transposition. Substitution is basically you take each letter in your text, which we call plain text, You take each letter in your plain text and you substitute it by something else. Either you substitute it by a symbol, or more commonly, you just substitute it by another letter in the same alphabet. And so you can substitute one letter by another letter, or you can take a pair of letters and you substitute them by another pair of letters. And this is basically the idea of substitution ciphers. The other type of operation, which is called transposition ciphers, is basically rearranging the letters, and we'll discuss it in a little bit. But let's start with actually classical substitution ciphers. One of the earliest ones known in history is a very simple cipher that you, I think, got acquainted with in CS2 or maybe CS1, I don't really remember. But it's called the Caesar cipher. The Caesar cipher is a very, very basic substitution cipher believed to be invented by Julius Caesar himself, and it was used in their military affairs to transport military messages. The idea in the Caesar cipher is that you just replace each letter by the third letter down in the alphabet. So if you have the alphabet here, A, B, C, D, E, F until Z, you substitute each letter with the third letter down the alphabet. So if you encounter a letter A in your plain text, you substitute it with B, C, and D, the third letter in the alphabet. So A is substituted with D. If you encounter the letter I, you will substitute it with the third letter in the alphabet, so 1, 2, and 3. You substitute it with L. Okay. If you encounter P, you will substitute it with the third letter in the alphabet, so 1, 2, and 3. You substitute it with S. Okay. And you continue doing that until, for example, W. W, you substitute it with the third letter, which is Z, so you substitute it with Z. After that, you run out of letters. So you have to actually go around the letters of the alphabet. And so if you have X, you substitute it with the third letter, so 1, 2, and 3, which is A, which is the first letter. So X is substituted with A, Y is substituted with B, and Z is substituted with C. So if you have a message like that, meet me after the toga party, you take each letter in this sentence and you substitute it with the third letter in the alphabet. So M, according to the map that we see here, M is substituted with P, E is substituted with H, another E is also substituted with H, T is substituted with W, and so on. And so this here is what is called the cipher text. It's the encrypted text. Okay. Because no one knew that the Romans were actually doing that, you would actually just only get the ciphertext message and you will think it is gibberish. You would think, what is that? I really don't know what this is. And so the attackers were fooled into not being able to read any of those messages. Obviously, in the Caesar cipher, we're using the key, which is 3. So the key here is actually what is used in the decryption as well. So because you are replacing each letter with the third one down the alphabet, in order to decrypt, you will replace each letter with 3 letters before. So if you encounter the letter P in the ciphertext, you will replace it with M. You will count 3 letters before P and you replace it with M. If you get the letter H, you will substitute it with 3 letters before and you replace it with E. This is how you decrypt. This is how you return the ciphertext to plain text. And the key in this case, in the Caesar cipher, the key was equal to 3. Obviously, this doesn't have to be the case. The key can be anything from 1 to 26. You can have just the next letter, so you replace A with B and B with C and C with D and so on. Or you can have any actually arbitrary key between 1 and 26. And so, generally speaking, you have the Caesar cipher as C, which is the letter of the ciphertext, is equal to P plus K. P is the letter of the plain text plus the key, which is the number that you are actually substituting, and you do mod 26 because you only have 26 letters of the alphabet. And so mod 26 ensures that if you run out of letters, you will go back and cycle from the beginning, just as we saw here with X, you substituted with A, Y with B, and Z with C. This is basically the rough idea of Caesar cipher, very simple cipher, and it was effective for a while for use by the Romans. Now let's actually think, how can we break the Caesar cipher? Given a ciphertext or an encrypted message like the one that you see in the slide, PHHW, PHDI, WHU, and so on. How can we actually break this cipher? How can we break the ciphertext? How can we, when we say break the ciphertext, we either want to obtain the plain text back or we want to figure out the key, or both. If we are able to figure out the key, this is actually better because you will not just be able to learn this particular sentence, but you'll be able to decrypt any message after that. So how can we decrypt the Caesar cipher? We have to think about what are the possibilities of the keys. The key, as we said, can be any number from 1 to 26. So there are only 26 possible keys. The key space in the Caesar cipher is actually quite limited. There are only 26 possible combinations. And so the attacker can very simply try all of them out. And so if you have this sentence here that we're trying to decrypt or trying to attack, what you can simply do is try all the keys. You try the key 1. And when we try the key 1, we actually return each letter to one position before it. So P becomes O, H becomes G, H becomes G, W becomes V, and so on. This decrypted sentence, if you use the key equal 1, doesn't make sense. It's not English that you recognize. If you try the key 2, so P becomes N, H becomes F, H becomes F, W becomes U, and so on, also it produces a sentence that you cannot recognize. Whereas when you actually try the key 3, you produce a sentence that is readable in the English language. Meet me after the toga party. Any other key, as you see here, will not produce a readable sentence. You can see that there are some keys that may, by coincidence, produce one correct word. For example, here, key 19 produces the first word is wood. Okay, so you might be fooled or tricked into thinking that this is the right key, but actually, if you read the rest of the sentence, it is still gibberish. So you would know that this is not the right key. Whereas the key 3 produces every word as a readable word in the English language. And this is actually a key requirement in breaking substitution ciphers. You would only know that you are successful if the broken phrase or the decrypted phrase has a meaningful structure in the language. If it's pure English, for example, or something like that, this is the only way you will know that you succeeded. If it is just a sequence of random letters, then you will not be able to figure out which one is the right key. So a key requirement in successful attack against the Caesar cipher, or actually any classical substitution cipher, is that you would be able to recognize the structure of the decrypted phrase. Okay? One way to deal with that is to do something like compression. You turn actually your letters into gibberish, and so the Caesar cipher will not work in this case. Basically, attacking it will not work because you will not be able to recognize this. But in any case, the Caesar cipher is very easy to break. What we did here is a type of attack which we call the brute force attack. And the brute force attack is basically the attacker trying every possible key, and one of them definitely has to be correct. Here, for example, there are only 26 possible keys. So if you try all of them, the key will definitely be one of them. So brute force is just trying all the possible key combinations until you find the right one. The next substitution cipher deals with this vulnerability, which is the limited key space, by actually having arbitrary substitutions for each letter. So in the Caesar cipher, we have a fixed shift. So we shift each letter by 3 positions. The monoalphabetic cipher has arbitrary shifts for each letter. So basically, you have a key, which is just a map, how you will map any letter of the alphabet to any other letter. So here we're saying, for example, A is D, B is K, C is V, D is Q, and so on. So you will see that the shift from plain text to ciphertext is not fixed. So between A and D, there are only 3 positions. Between B and K, there are more positions. So there is not a fixed shift in the key positions between plain text and ciphertext. And the key in this case is this entire map. The receiver must have this entire map to be able to decrypt, meaning that the receiver needs to have not just one digit, which is the key is equal to 3 or the key is equal to 10 or whatever, as in the Caesar cipher. The receiver needs to have the entire map, what each letter corresponds to, so that the attacker, or the receiver is able to shift or return the keys back to, return the letters back to plain text. An example of the monoalphabetic cipher according to this map is shown here. So this is actually the phrase that we are trying to encrypt. if we wish to replace letters. This is what we want to encrypt. So if we go to the map, I is replaced with W, so I becomes W. F is replaced with I, so F is replaced with I. W, we go to W, it's replaced with R. So this is basically how you replace everything. This is how you encrypt. So this here is the ciphertext. This is what gets sent to the receiver, and this is what the attacker now has to work with. If the legitimate receiver wishes to return this ciphertext back to the plain text, they must be in possession of this map. Okay, so they will get the ciphertext letter W. They will go to the map and see where is W. So W is here. The plain text letter that corresponds to W is I, and so they will return W to become I. Okay. Now, in the Caesar cipher, we only had 26 possible keys. Here, we have 26 factorial possible keys because you can have any arbitrary mapping of the letters of the alphabet, and because you have 26 letters, you have 26 factorial possible combinations of these 26 letters. This is approximately equal to 4 times 10 to the power 26 possible keys. This is actually a huge key space, even by modern standards. This is a very, very big key space. And so, because the monoalphabetic cipher was used in the past, before even the invention of computers, if you wanted to use brute force, you would have to try through this very large key space to find the right mapping between plain text and ciphertext, or the right key in this case. So we might think that, okay, this makes us safe. We actually dealt with the problem of the Caesar cipher. We're no longer able to do brute force. And even though it is true that the brute force attack would be unlikely to succeed against the monoalphabetic cipher due to the very large key space, we are still not safe. We're not protected. Why? Because there is actually another type of attack that can succeed easily with limited or with little effort against the monoalphabetic cipher. To explain that, let's actually consider this encrypted text. So we have this piece of text, and we wish to try and break it. By the way, throughout this course, I will actually ask you to pause the video and get a pen and paper and try to actually solve something with me or think about a problem with me. And here is actually an example of that. I want you to pause the video at this time, and I want you to look at this ciphertext, and I want you to think, how can you actually break the monoalphabetic cipher if you only receive this text? So you don't have the key, you don't have the mapping, you only have this ciphertext, and you wish to obtain the plain text back. Pause the video, think about it for a while, and then play it back. Okay, so the answer to this question is, if you take a look at this ciphertext, you will notice that there are some letters that are repeated more than others. For example, if you take the letter U, this letter is repeated many more times than the others. What happens is that in the English language, the words have stable structure, and there are actually letters of the alphabet that are repeated more than others. For example, this figure here shows the likelihood of a letter being available in the alphabet. So for example, we find that the letter E is the most occurring letter in all the words of the English alphabet, followed by the letter T, followed by the letter A. Okay? So if you have a ciphertext message like this one, what clues do you have to be able to decrypt? If you count the occurrence of each letter, basically you're counting the frequency of each ciphertext letter, and you figure out that U is the letter that is repeated the most. And you know that in the English language, E is the letter that gets repeated the most. Then you can guess that now the letter U in the ciphertext corresponds to the letter E. This is actually called frequency analysis. When you take the ciphertext and you count the occurrences of each letter, we will actually find that the letter that is repeated the most is P. After that, it is Z. After that, it is S. So if you count the occurrences of the letters in this text, you'll find that P occurs the most, followed by Z, followed by S. So what you can do here is that you can assume that P and Z are ENT. the letters P and Z in the ciphertext correspond to E and T in the plaintext. Someone might say, well, this is not guaranteed. The answer is yes, it's not guaranteed. It might be that P corresponds to T and Z corresponds to E, or the opposite. You cannot actually be sure because it might be actually a matter of coincidence. What you can only do here is guess. So you can guess that P corresponds to E and Z corresponds to T. Your guess is likely to be correct if you have access to a very large amount of ciphertext. The more access to ciphertext you have, the more likely that the frequencies that you count correspond to the real frequencies of the English language. So if you only have access to a short phrase, then absolutely yes, it might just be a coincidence. P and Z might not correspond to E and T at all. They might correspond to two different letters just by a matter of coincidence in this particular phrase. But if you have access to a large enough ciphertext, it is unlikely that your guess will be wrong. The more access you have to ciphertext, the more likely that your guess is the correct one. Okay, and this is what happens in frequency analysis. In frequency analysis, we just keep guessing. We keep trying over and over and over again until we end up with the right guess. Okay, now what we did here is we just guessed actually single letters. There are actually additional structures of the English language that can actually help us with the guess. For example, we can look at the frequencies of two-letter combinations, which are called digrams. For example, the two most commonly occurring letters in the English language together as a pair are TH. Okay? This is the most commonly occurring digram. So if you look at the ciphertext and you look where are the most commonly occurring digrams, you will find that ZW is the one that occurs the most. And so you can guess that ZW corresponds to TH. And then here, this will actually confirm your first guess. In the first guess, we said that Z corresponds to T. Now, if we say ZW corresponds to TH, then this actually confirms your guess. So now you have an additional clue that you are on the right track. And so you can guess that now ZWP is the, because you guessed in the first step that P corresponds to E. So now ZWT becomes the. And you can keep going. You can look into digrams, you can look into trigrams, and you keep analyzing and you keep guessing. Once you decrypt a letter, you can actually decrypt it in the entire ciphertext, all the occurrences. Once you encrypt a diagram, you can replace it anywhere in the text, and you keep going until you are actually able to break this this phrase. And the broken phrase is seen here. Okay, so I recommend that you go through this exercise, take the ciphertext, try to look for monograms, which are single letters, and digrams and trigrams, and try to decrypt it. If you come up with the right actually plain text, then you would have done a great job. Okay. Now, frequency analysis against monoalphabetic ciphers are not complicated, especially if the attacker has access to a lot of ciphertext, which is likely occurrence if there is frequent communications between a sender and the receiver. So even though the key space in the monoalphabetic cipher is huge, we have not yet created a safe or a secure classical substitution cipher. Because even though brute force attack is not easy, we have another type of attack which is called a cryptanalysis attack, which is frequency analysis in this case. So the problem with the monoalphabetic cipher comes from the fact that the map between the plaintext and the ciphertext is fixed. That means that if you have a letter E in the plaintext, it will be replaced every single time with the same letter. In our example here, the letter E is replaced with F. So every time in the plaintext the letter E occurs, you will find an F in the plaintext. Every time the letter T occurs, you will find a letter U in the ciphertext. Okay? Every time. This is why frequency analysis works. Because if you count the occurrences of the letters F and the letters U in the ciphertext, you will be able to guess that these correspond to T and E because they occur the most. Okay? So, because the mapping is constant, even though it's an arbitrary mapping for each letter is actually mapped to a different letter, but the mapping is a fixed one. Every time you encrypt, you actually have to use the same map. You can change the map completely, but that means you're actually using a new monoalphabetic cipher in this case. This was actually handled in the next type of substitution cipher that we will discuss, which is called the polyalphabetic cipher. And polyalphabetic, as opposed to monoalphabetic, means that the shift or the mapping of the letters is different every time. That means if you have a letter E, let's say the first time it's encrypted to be F, the next time it should be encrypted to something else, let's say X. If you have a letter T, the first time it will be encrypted, for example, to B, the next time it will be encrypted to Y, third time it will be encrypted to F, so on. That means the map is not constant. Every time you encrypt, you are actually encrypting to something else. And so you cannot now count the occurrences of the letter F and say it corresponds to E, because it's not the only occurrence. Maybe this time it corresponds to E, maybe X would be the one that corresponds to E the next time, you would not know. So frequency analysis will not work in a straightforward way in this type of cipher. And an example for that type of cipher is called the Vigenère cipher. In the Vigenère cipher, this is actually a type of polyalphabetic cipher. What we do is we write our plain text in a row like this one, and we choose a key. And the key has to be something that is agreed upon between the sender and the receiver. So only the sender and the receiver would know it. For example, here, let's say we are using the key word deceptive. And you write the key repetitively on top of the plain text. So for example, here we have deceptive, deceptive, deceptive. And it doesn't actually have to be that the last word, the last letter of the key corresponds to the last letter of the plain text. You can actually write 2 keys and a half, for example, or 2 keys and 3/4. You just write actually as many key letters as you need to encrypt your plain text, regardless of how long the plain text is. So how do you encrypt? Let's say you want to encrypt the letter D, you want to encrypt the letter W using the key letter D, okay? Okay, so to do that, you go to the Vigenère table, okay, or the Vigenère tableau. We want to encrypt the letter W using the key letter D. So the key tells us the row, the plain text letter tells us the column. So the key is D, the letter is W, the intersection of the two is Z. Okay, so the intersection of the row corresponding to D and the column corresponding to W is Z. So the encryption of W using D is Z, as you see here. Now we want to encrypt E and E. You go to the row marked E and you go to the column marked E. The intersection of the two is I. So E and E is encrypted to I. Now we want to encrypt A using the key letter C. So we go to the column marked A, the row marked A, the column marked C, and the encryption is also C. So A encrypted with C leads to C as well. And you go on, you keep continuing that. This is basically the encryption. The decryption is the opposite. Let's say you have this ciphertext and you want to decrypt it. And if you want to decrypt it, you are the legitimate receiver. That means you already have possession of the key. And so if you want to decrypt Z with the key D, you go actually to the row marked D, so the row marked D, and you find where does Z occur. So Z occurs here. You go to the head of the column and you find that this is the letter W, so the plain text is W. If you want to decrypt the letter I using the keyword E, you go to the row marked E and you look for I in this row. You find I here, you go to the head of the column, it is E, so E is encrypted to E in this case. Why is this more secure than the polyalphabetic cipher? Let's say here you have an occurrence of the letter W. Here the letter W is encrypted using the keyword D and it becomes Z. What if you have another occurrence of the letter W elsewhere and it is encrypted using a different key letter? The result will be a different ciphertext. We can take actually the example E. In this column, E is encrypted with E and the result is I. Here, E is encrypted with P and the result is T. Here, E is encrypted with C and the result is G. So every time you are encrypting the letter E, you are encrypting, if you are encrypting it with a different key letter, you will end up with a different ciphertext letter. And so you cannot count the occurrences of a single letter in the ciphertext and say this will correspond to the most commonly occurring letter in the English language. It doesn't work this way. And so this makes frequency analysis significantly more difficult. However, it is not actually 100% immune. Okay? And now I want you to actually pause the video again, and I want you to think of a way to break the Vigenère cipher. Okay? Here, you only have access to the ciphertext. You don't know anything other than the ciphertext. You don't know the key. You don't know how long the key is. You don't actually know anything about the the encryption other than the ciphertext that you have in front of you. Pause the video and think about how you can actually break it, how you can obtain the key and then obtain the plaintext. Okay, the key to breaking the Vigenère cipher is, first of all, you have to figure out the length of the key. You have to guess the length of the key. Now, what you can do is you try to look for occurrences of 3 or more letters in a row. For example, here in this ciphertext, you will find that there is the occurrence of VTW. VTW occurs twice. There are, I think, more occurrences, if I remember correctly. Where else? No, doesn't actually matter right now. VTW will actually do. So if you count the difference in characters between VTW in the first time and VTW the second time, it's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So the second VTW comes after 9 characters from the first VTW. Now, this again can be a complete coincidence, but it could be that VTW has occurred a second time because there were 3 letters of the plaintext, RED versus RED, that happened by coincidence to be encrypted with the same 3 letters of the cipher, the key, EPT and EPT. So RED encrypted with EPT results in VTW in the ciphertext. What does this actually tell us? It tells us that there is an occurrence of these 3 letters in the plaintext, and there is a likely occurrence of the same 3 letters at the same distance of the key. And this gives us a hint about the length of the key. That means that the length of the key is likely to be a multiple or a factor of 9. It could be 3, it could be 9, it could be more than that. Oh, sorry, it could be 3 or it could be 9. Which one would be the right length? At this point, you do not know. You need more information. You need to look in the ciphertext for more occurrences of repetitions of 3 or more letters. Okay? Let's say you find another occurrence of repeated letters at, for example, distance 18, and another 3 letters are occurring at distance 9. What would be the lowest, the greatest common divisor among those? This is actually the most likely length of the key. In this case, the most likely length of the key will be 9. And so and now you have a hint about the length of the key. This is, by the way, called the Babbage-Kasiski method. Okay, you look for repetitions in the ciphertext, and with these repetitions, you guess the likely length of the key. Okay. Okay, what do you do then if you know the length of the key, or if you have a likelihood for the length of the key? Basically, let's take a look at what happens if you encrypt with the letter D. The letter D occurs at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Every 9 letters of the key, you have D. After 9 more, you'll have another D. Okay? That means every 9 letters, you are encrypting with the letter D. If you take E and you add 9, you will be encrypting with the second E. Add 9 more, you will be encrypting with the third E. You take C, after 9 letters, you will be encrypting with the letter C. 9 more, you will be encrypting with the letter C again. Every 9 characters, you are encrypting with the same key letter. That means that every 9 characters, you are actually encrypting with a fixed alphabet. Okay? So if you are encrypting with the letter D, it is as if you have a Caesar cipher, or actually a monoalphabetic cipher, that is corresponding just to this row. So this here is the mapping that corresponds to the letter D. So with the letter D, A becomes D, B becomes E, C becomes F, D becomes G, E becomes H, and so on. It is actually a Caesar cipher that corresponds to the letter D. If you take, for example, the key V, okay, which occurs every 9 letters because the length of the word deceptive is 9. This is another Caesar cipher that corresponds to the letter V. It's a different mapping. So every 9 letters, you have a different mapping, but the mapping is fixed every 9 letters. That means every 9 letters, you have a mapping that will occur another time. So if you get your ciphertext and you divide it into collections every 9 letters, so you take Z and you take with it R and you take with it H, and if you have more, you take them as a group. And this group are the group of letters that have been encrypted with the letter D. And then you take I, you take with it Z, you take with it C, and you take with it anything that occurs after 9 letters starting from this point. And this becomes the group of the letters that have been encrypted with the letter E. And then you go to C, you take the letter C, you take the letter G, you take the letter Q. These are the letters that have been encrypted with the letter C. Now you have collections. You have groups of letters that have been encrypted with a single key letter. You can then do frequency analysis on these letters. That means you take Z, R, and H, and you do frequency analysis on them. You count actually the maximum number of occurrences of a letter. This then corresponds to E, the second one corresponds to T, and so on. You divide them into group, and because in each group there is actually only one mapping, you can do frequency analysis on that group. So this is actually the core of the Babbage-Kasisky method. This is why it is important to figure out the length of the key. Once you figure out the length of the key, you will be able to divide your ciphertext into collections of letters where each collection is encrypted with a single key letter, and you do frequency analysis on those collections individually or independently, and you end up with the plain text again. Okay, so how do we then reduce the chance of this attack being successful? It all has to do with the length of the key. A short key is likely to lead to many repetitions. That means if the key is, for example, the word red. Okay? Short key, 3 letters. That means when you encrypt, you will have red, red, red. That means it is likely that you will have 3 letters in the plain text encrypted with the same 3 letters of the key, leading to the same 3 letters of the ciphertext, and this will happen over and over. And so here it becomes very easy to guess the length of the key and then do frequency analysis as we explained. Whereas if you have a long key, it will not have repetitions. It will be repeated less times. And so a longer key that is not repeated will make actually the code difficult or more difficult to break. Okay, but in any case, the Vigenère cipher is vulnerable to frequency analysis in the method or using the method that we have actually discussed. This ends our discussion of the substitution ciphers, and with that, we can actually discuss the idea of having an unbreakable cipher. Since this is a history lesson, we can actually discuss this briefly. There is no such thing. There is no such thing as an unbreakable cipher. If we look at the Vigenère cipher, in order for this to be unbreakable, you have to have a key that is used once and only once and is not repeated ever. You have to have a key that is as long as the method. You use the key once and only once. You have to have a key that is as long as the message. And you have to use the key once and only once, and then you throw it away, never to use it again. This is very difficult to have. It's actually not practical. You have to generate an arbitrarily long or arbitrarily large number of keys, and you have to find a way to exchange them between the sender and the receiver securely. This is a whole other headache. And so it is not feasible to have what is called the one-time pad. This is the theoretically unbreakable cipher, one where the key is as long as the message, it is used once and only once and never used again. Why is there the requirement that the key is used once and only once, never used again? Because if you use it more than time, you'll start seeing patterns. And if you see patterns, you will start to do frequency analysis and the whole thing is destroyed. Whereas if you use the key once, Here you have actually an interesting example. This is a key, and this is the ciphertext, as you see here. If you use a different key on the same ciphertext, you can actually end up with a different sentence that is also recognizable in the English language. So if you use this key, you will end up with the plain text, Mr. Mustard with the candlestick in the hall. If you use this key, you will end up with Miss Scarlet with the knife in the library. This is actually just a decryption because the mapping between plain text and ciphertext is arbitrary. And if the key is used only once, then there is no way for an attacker to know which one is the right phrase. There's arbitrarily a large number of mappings. The attacker would not even be able to know that this is the right translation in this case. The attacker would only be able to guess if there are repetitions, and there would be repetitions if the key is reused. That's actually the deal. Now we can go to the second type of classical ciphers, which are called the transposition ciphers. And the transposition ciphers, they basically go to permutation. They rearrange the letters. So substitution ciphers, as we saw, you substitute a letter with another letter in the alphabet. Transposition ciphers, you rearrange. For example, if you have the sentence, meet me after the toga party, the first transposition cipher that we will study is called the rail fence cipher. And in the rail fence cipher, you basically write the letters in 2 rows and you read them. You write the letters in 2 rows and you read each row. So, for example, this will be meet me after the toga party. This is how you write it, and this is how you generate the ciphertext. Here, the key is equal to 2 because you only have 2 rows. The key can be anything. You can actually have 3 rows. If the key is equal to 3, then you will have meet me after the toga party, and so on. And you read the rows one after the other. So it will be M, T, A, E, H, and then E, M, F, R, E, and so on. Okay. You can have actually any arbitrary number of rows, and using that you can encrypt. And if you know actually the key, you know the number of rows, then you can easily decrypt. Obviously, the rail fence cipher is very, very easy. It's straightforward and very easy to break. It's vulnerable also to several types of cryptanalysis or things like that. One that is a little bit more sophisticated is called the row transposition cipher. Basically, you determine the length of the key. Let's say, for example, the key has length 7, and you create basically 7 columns, and you write your plain text in these columns. So the phrase that we want to encrypt is attack postponed until 2 a.m. You write them in rows, so attack postponed until 2 a.m. and then you have fillers because you have to complete the matrix, you have to complete the block, so you just write any fillers to just complete. And then the way you actually generate the ciphertext is that you have a key, and the key is just a sequence of numbers. So this is actually the key 4312567. You wrote the plain text as rows, you read them as columns, and you read them as columns starting with the or in ascending orders. So you go to the column marked 1, you read that column TTNA. Then you go to the column marked 2, it is APTM. So these are the next 4 letters. 3, that's TSUO, and then 4, AODW, and so on. So you write the letters or you write the plain text in rows and you read them in columns according to the key. And so the receiver must have actually the right key. The receiver will then count the number of letters in the ciphertext and will then learn what are the number of rows, and they can actually write the letters in the columns according to the right order. So the receiver would have the right key 4312567, and then the receiver will receive this. It will count them, and it will learn that each column has only 4 letters, and it will go to the first 4 letters, and it will write them in the column marked 1. And then the next 4 letters, APTM, it will write them in the column marked 2, APTM. It will do the same in ascending order, so 1, 2, and then 3, 4, 5, 6, and sorry, this is 7. Okay, and then you can actually read the plain text in rows back. This is how you decrypt. So row transposition is a little bit more secure than rail fence, but it is still vulnerable to a wide range of frequency analysis attacks. Research over the years have led researchers to figure out that substitution ciphers on their own are vulnerable. Transposition ciphers on their own are vulnerable, but if you use stages of substitution and or permutation, you end up with a much more resilient encryption algorithm. So if you use, for example, 2 or more substitutions in a row, so you have, for example, monoalphabetic followed by Vigenère, or Vigenère followed by another round of Vigenère. Okay, this is way more complicated. Or you have row transposition followed by another row transposition, or row transposition followed by rail fence. What is even more secure is that if you have substitution followed by transposition, or vice versa, transposition followed by substitution. Because they are two types of cryptography operations, they make the ciphertext much harder to guess. So you have substitution, for example, using Vigenère, and then you follow that by row transposition. This makes it much more difficult to break. And this is what is recommended actually to be used. Okay. The last topic that we will discuss in this lecture is what are known as router machines. And it is actually the last topic that we will discuss because this, as we said, became the breaking point. This defined a major change in the history of cryptography. And the change was from human-based encryption and decryption to machine-based encryption and decryption. This is what the Germans invented in World War II. It was a machine called Enigma. It looked like a typewriter, as you see here. The Japanese had another one that was called Purple, and it was the job of the Allies to figure out a way to break these machines. If you watch The Imitation Game, you will see also that it's not just the fact that the encryption operation itself was very sophisticated, as we will see, but also they changed the key every night. And so every night they would have to start from scratch. They were guessing, they were doing frequency analysis and all of that. Every night they would actually have to start from scratch. And so what is a router machine? It basically consists of routers. You see these routers here, as you will see in the figure. These are these are 6 routers. The Enigma machine actually had 3 routers. Routers are those gears that shift their position circularly. Okay. And the 3 routers, on the outermost one, you had 26 positions, and each position was connected to a button in the typewriter corresponding to a letter in the alphabet, as we see here. So A, B, C, D, E, F until Z, each one of those is connected to a position in the router. And then this then is the input to the first router. The output of the first router is connected using some kind of wired connection to the input of the second router. So for example, here you see that the position marked 1 is connected to the position marked 1 here. The position marked 2 is connected to the position marked 2 here. Okay. So the output of the first router is connected using wires to the input of the second router, and the input of the second router, the output of the second router is connected to the input of the third router, and then the output of the third router is another letter of the alphabet. So let's see what happens. Let's say someone presses A. A corresponds to position 24 on the input of the first router. Position 24, as you see here, if you trace this wire, it is connected to position 24 here. Position 24 here is connected to position 24 here. And then position 24 here is connected, for example, to 18. And then 18 is connected to 18, which is B. So if you press A on the typewriter, out comes B. If you take another example, C, that is 26 connected here, and then this is connected to the input, to the second input. So 7 is connected to 7, and then to 20, and then E. So if you press C, out comes E. If you press a letter, out comes another letter. So just from this description, you may say, well, so what? This is just a normal substitution operation. This is actually not the end. So the wiring is fixed, but the routers, they shift. So every time the user presses on a single key of the alphabet, the rotor shifts by one position. So the position 24 here, as you see here, is connected to position 24. Initially, 24 will correspond to A. After the user presses on A, the rotor shifts by one position, and so B now corresponds to 24. So now, the next time the user presses B, out will come B. And after that, the rotor will shift to another position, and now C will correspond to 24. And now when the user presses C, out will come B. So every time the user presses a button, the rotors shift by one position, and according to the fixed wiring inside the rotors, the output will be something else. And when the first rotor completes one complete round around itself, the second rotor will now shift by one position. And when the second rotor completes one whole round, the third rotor will also shift by one position. So even though the internal wirings are constant or are fixed, because the rotors shift, the output will be different every time you press a letter. Now, the Germans not only did that, but they were changing the wirings every night. So every night the wirings would change, and so the frequency, or sorry, the pattern of occurrences of the letters would be completely different every day. This is why it was almost impossible to break this machine by hand. If you have 3 rotors and each rotor has 26 letters, you have 26 power 3 or 17,576 different alphabets. It's a huge space to do frequency analysis. And the Japanese machine, I think, had 6 rotors, so that's actually 26 power 6, which is much more difficult. This is why Alan Turing decided that it is impossible to do it by hand. I'm just actually going to invent a machine. And even though Alan Turing did that, the machine itself or by itself was not sufficient. It was still a huge key space, and that was the very first computer. It was still not sufficient. Alan Turing then had to go and find a commonly repeated word in every letter or in every message that the Germans sent, and it was Heil Hitler. And this gave him a clue where to actually start searching, and this is something that we are going to discuss in the next lecture. But this is actually the end of our discussion for this lecture. I hope you will be able to study it, prepare your questions for the interactive session, be there to answer any of your questions, and you will see some examples in the tutorials as well. We'll speak to you next time.